Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Yvonne Flowers. I'm one of the co-chairs of the Black History Committee, and I want to welcome you to today's Student Government Association and Black History sponsor Lyceum. Our speaker today is Mr. Jim Lucas. Mr. Lucas is a noted public speaker who has performed at over 100 colleges and universities throughout the country, as well as Japan, South Korea, and Germany. He is an expert on the life and times of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. Mr. Lucas is also an accomplished actor, currently co-starring in a critically acclaimed play, The Meeting, a powerful drama about the lives, philosophies, and times of Dr. King and Malcolm X. Mr. Lucas' resemblance to and interpretation of Dr. King has been called remarkable, awe-inspiring, uncanny, and soulful. So it's my pleasure to welcome Mr. Jim Lucas.
If I could help somebody, as I pass along, if I could cheer somebody with a word or a song, if I could show somebody that he's traveling wrong, then my living will not be in vain. If I could do my duty as a Christian altar, if I could bring salvation to a world once wrought, if I could spread the message as the Master taught, then my living will not be in vain. Thank you very kindly, Ms. Yvonne, for that very warm introduction. Thank you. To the deans, administration officials, the students, faculty, staff, ladies and gentlemen, it is certainly an honor for me to be here at Dutchess Community College, and I am grateful that you invited me to participate with you in your celebration of Black History Month. And in the brief time allotted me, I'm going to reflect on the life of a man who, in my opinion, did more to change the social, economical, and political landscape of this nation than any other one individual in modern U.S. history. I'm talking about none other than the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. I will be reflecting on those 12 years of his life where he was thrust into the national spotlight as a civil rights leader. But first, just a little on his background. Dr. King was born on January 15, 1929. Just 19 years later, he graduated from Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia. That same year, 1948, he was ordained as a Baptist minister. In 1953, he married Coretta Scott. They later had 4 children, Martin Luther III, Dexter Scott, Yolanda Denise, and Bernice Albertine. In 1954, he was installed as the pastor of the prestigious Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. In 1955, he received his PhD from Boston U. It was later that year that an event would take place that would change the life of Dr. King and his family forever. It was on December 1, 1955, that Rosa Parks took a bus ride. It's amazing what you will do when your feet get tired. On that day, Rosa refused to get up to give her seat to a white man and move to the back of the bus. You must understand that if you were black and you lived in Montgomery at that time and you wanted to ride the city buses, you got on the front and you paid your fare. Then you stepped off of the bus, moved down the side, and re-entered from the rear. The first half of the bus was reserved for whites. The second half was reserved for blacks. And that policy held true even if the entire bus route was through a black community. Blacks often found themselves standing beside empty seats during rush hour. And the black religious community wanted to change that policy. In fact, they were looking to press this issue in court. And when Rosa Parks was arrested, they thought that they had found the right individual, the right person with the right moral and ethical background, someone made of sterner stuff, someone who could deal with the rigors of a long and drawn-out trial. She agreed to participate. So those leaders hastily formed an organization to fight this in court, an organization they called the Montgomery Improvement Association, the MIA. And they elected this young man who had just moved into town. You know how it is, you pick on the new guy. 27-year-old Martin Luther King Jr. as their president and spokesperson. Rosa was scheduled to go to trial the following Monday, December 5th. And Dr. King thought that something should be done on that day to show their disdain, their disgust, their dissatisfaction with the way blacks are being treated on the buses. Perhaps a bus boycott. The others agreed, so they hastily printed flyers and posters for distribution throughout the black community. The newspapers, being as tenacious then as they are today, got wind of the story and inadvertently helped out the MIA by printing a front-page story in the Sunday newspaper about the boycott. On Monday, Rosa went to trial, was found guilty, and fined $10. That conviction would later be appealed all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. But the boycott was successful. Virtually 100% participation from the black community. Nearly 50,000 blacks refused absolutely from riding the buses that Monday. The boycott was so successful that they decided to carry it on for a while longer. So they created some carpools and van pools, and even the black-owned taxi drivers helped out by charging the same amount of money that you would have paid had you been on the bus. But after 10 or 15 days, those city leaders saw that this MIA meant business, so they took them to court. And they won an injunction stating that the MIA had created an illegal transportation authority since they were charging people to ride in these carpools. They decided to carry on the boycott anyway with volunteer contributions. But after a while, these volunteer contributions were not enough to maintain all of these old cars and vans. So Dr. King set out across the country to raise the money needed to carry on the boycott. Traveling with his wife, Coretta Scott, and his companion, the Reverend Dr. Ralph David Abernathy, and his wife, Juanita, they found that segregated buses were not the only problems confronting many blacks throughout the South. They found that they often had to sleep in their car because they could not find a motel or a hotel that would accept them. They often went hungry because they could not find a restaurant that would seat or serve them. But his travels were successful. He was able to raise the tens of thousands of dollars needed to carry on the boycott. It was on the 13th day of November, 1956, that the U.S. Supreme Court ruled unanimously, upholding a lower court determination that segregation on buses in Alabama was unconstitutional. A boycott, which was designed to last for one day, went on for 380 days. The success of that boycott is what propelled Dr. King into the national spotlight as a civil rights leader. Believing that a larger, more comprehensive organization would have a greater impact on civil rights, Dr. King and about 30 other individuals, most of whom were black ministers from throughout the South, formed a new organization in 1957, an organization they called the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC. Dr. King was voted unanimously as its president. That then became the base for his national civil rights operation. In subsequent years, he participated in numerous sit-ins, boycotts, demonstrations, freedom rides, and marches pushing for civil rights. And as a result of his activities, he was arrested nearly 24 times. Perhaps the most significant arrest or noted arrest took place in the spring of 1963 in Birmingham, Alabama. Birmingham, Alabama at that time was known as the most segregated city in America. Blacks were not allowed to use the public parks, the public pools, not even the public library. They could not sit down and eat in any public restaurant. The local chapter of the SCLC wanted to change that. So they scheduled a series of sit-ins and boycotts. they invited Dr. King to participate. When word got out that Dr. King had agreed to participate, some opposition began to arise regarding his coming. Dr. King was saddened to learn that the greatest opposition was coming from the white religious community. In fact, 5 white clergy got together and wrote Dr. King an open letter, a letter which said in summary, Dr. King, we don't need you in Birmingham. We know that we have problems, but we want to take care of them ourselves. You are an outsider. All we need is a little time. All you have to do is wait. Well, Dr. King knew that he couldn't wait. However, prior to his going, he did send in the lawyers from SCLC headquarters to review all of the laws and ordinances in Birmingham. He also sent in the trainers to train those who would participate in the sit-ins so that they'd be carried out in an orderly fashion. He also raised a large sum of money to bail out anyone who might get arrested. When everything was in place, Dr. King went to Birmingham. On the first day, they sent down 6 to sit in at the lunch counters. They were all arrested. On the second day, a dozen were sent down to sit in. They were all arrested. On the third day, 100 were sent down to sit in at the lunch counters and restaurants. They too were arrested. On the fourth day, Dr. King said, "It is now time for me to participate." He, along with several hundred others, went downtown and to sit in at the lunch counters and restaurants. They were all arrested. However, Dr. King was not put in with the general population. He was put in solitary confinement, not allowed to see anyone, not his wife, not even his attorney. You must understand that back then it was very scary for a black man, especially a black civil rights leader, to be arrested. Often you would find him the next day dead. The police report would simply say he tried to escape. We had to shoot him. Or he would be found hanging in his cell. The police report would simply say he committed suicide. There'd be no mention of the fact that his arms and legs were bound. 2 days had passed. No one had seen or heard from Dr. King. 3 days, still not a word. People are getting very worried. After many frantic telephone calls, excuse me, Dr. King's wife called then U.S. Attorney Bobby Kennedy, who in turn put pressure on the Alabama State's Attorney, who in turn pressured the Birmingham police. Dr. King was allowed to see his attorney. When his attorney got there, he said, "Dr. King, I've got some good news and some bad news. First, the good news. The sit-in and boycotts are going as planned. The jails are overflowing. In fact, those that are being arrested now are being held down at the stadium. The bad news? Well, you know that large sum of money you raised to bail people out? Well, we're out of money. I'm sorry, but we can't bail you out." Dr. King said that was fine. He'd rather be there with his people anyway. Having a little time on his hands, he decided to respond to that letter from the clergy. That response has since come to be known as the letter from Birmingham jail. I encourage all of you to Google that letter and to read it in its entirety. But in that response, Dr. King said in part, and I quote, "We've learned through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. For many years now, I have heard the word wait. It rings in the ear of every Negro with piercing familiarity. This wait has almost always meant never. Perhaps it is easy for those who have never felt the stinging dart of segregation to say wait. But when you have seen vicious mobs lynch your mothers and fathers at will or drown your brothers and sisters at whim, when you have seen hate-filled policemen curse, kick, brutalize, and even kill your black brothers with impunity, when you see the vast majority of your 20 million black brothers smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in the midst of an affluent society, when you are humiliated day in and day out by signs that read white and colored, when you take a cross-country drive and find you must sleep in the uncomfortable corners of your automobile night after night because no motel will accept you. When you're haunted by day and harried by night by the fact that you are a Negro, living constantly at tiptoe stands, never quite knowing what to expect next, plagued by inner fears and outward resentments. When you are forever fighting a degenerating sense of nobodiedness, then you will understand why we find it difficult to wait. There comes a time when the cup of endurance runs over, and men are no longer willing to be plunged into the abyss of despair. I hope, dear sirs, you can understand our legitimate and unavoidable impatience, unquote. Remaining in jail for another 4 or 5 days and continuously negotiating with city leaders, an agreement was reached. Blacks would be allowed to use the public parks, the public pools, the public library, would be allowed to sit down and eat in public restaurants. All charges would be dropped against those arrested during the sit-ins and boycotts. While this agreement was reached in Birmingham, similar agreements were reached in other cities throughout the nation that same summer. And while Dr. King agreed that these agreements were fine, he thought that there should be a law to cover all people in all cities throughout this nation. He thought that pressure should be brought to bear on the U.S. Congress for such a law. So Dr. King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference joined hands with the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, for a march on Washington. That march took place later on that same summer, on August 28th, 1963. And that is when Dr. King gave his now famous "I Have a Dream" speech, a speech that almost didn't take place. You see, the night before the march, someone sabotaged the sound system. They were expecting thousands of people, so they were going to need a sound system if any of the presenters were to be heard. The U.S. Park Service, who was responsible for installing the sound system, told Dr. King that it would take 3 days to repair. The march was scheduled to take place the following morning. After many frantic telephone calls, Dr. King called then U.S. Attorney Bobby Kennedy, who enlisted the help of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, who got out there that night and replaced the sound system. The speech itself was not written until the night before the march. Now, my research shows me that the students at Dutchess Community College have never waited until the last moment to write a paper or report. That is true, right? Okay. It wasn't until around midnight that Dr. King got back to his hotel room, working with 2 of his closest advisors, did they finish writing that speech. So that next morning, standing on the mall, speaking to a crowd of more than 250,000 people, and for the first time, a black man being carried live on national television, Dr. King said, "I am happy to join with you today in what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation. 50 years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity. But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. 100 years later. The Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity 100 years later. The Negro is still languished in the corners of American society and finds himself in exile in his own land. And so we've come here today to dramatize this shameful condition. In a sense, we've come to our nation's capital to cash a check. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds. But we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity of this nation. And so we've come to cash this check, a check that will give us upon demand the riches of freedom and the security of justice. We have also come to this hallowed spot to remind America of the fierce urgency of now. This is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or to take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. Now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. Now is the time to rise from the dark and desolate valley of segregation to the sunlit path of racial justice. Now is the time to make justice a reality for all of God's children. It will be fatal for the nation to overlook the urgency of the moment. This sweltering summer of the Negro's legitimate discontent will not pass until there is an invigorating autumn of freedom and equality. 1963 is not an end, but a beginning. And those who hoped that the Negro needed to blow off steam and will now be content will have a rude awakening if the nation returns to business as usual. There will be neither rest nor tranquility in America until the Negro is granted his citizenship rights. The whirlwinds of revolt will continue to shake the foundations of our nation until the bright day of justice emerges. But that is something that I must say to my people who stand on the warm threshold which leads into the palace of justice. In the process of gaining our rightful place, we must not be guilty of wrongful deeds. Let us not seek to satisfy our thirst for freedom by drinking from the cup of bitterness and hatred. We must forever conduct our struggle on the high plane of dignity and discipline. We must not allow our creative protest to degenerate into physical violence. Again and again, we must rise to the majestic heights of meeting physical force with soul force. The marvelous new militancy which has engulfed the Negro community must not lead us to a distrust of all white people. For many of our white brothers, as evidenced by their presence here today, have come to realize that their destiny is tied up with our destiny. And they have come to realize that their freedom is inextricably bound to our freedom. We cannot walk alone. And as we walk, we must make the pledge that we shall always march ahead. We cannot turn back. There are those who are asking the devotees of civil rights, when will you be satisfied? We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is a victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality. We can never be satisfied. As long as our basic mobility is from a smaller ghetto to a larger one, we cannot be satisfied. As long as a Negro in Mississippi cannot vote, and a Negro in New York believes he has nothing for which to vote. No, we are not satisfied, and we will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. I am not unmindful that some of you have come here out of great trials and tribulations. Some of you have come fresh from narrow jail cells. Some of you have come from areas where your quest for freedom have left you battered by the storms of persecution and staggered by the winds of police brutality. You have been the veterans of creative suffering. Continue to work with the faith that unearned suffering is redemptive. Go back to Mississippi. Go back to Alabama. Go back to South Carolina. Go back to Georgia. Go back to Louisiana. Go back to the slums and ghettos of our northern cities, knowing that somehow this situation can and will be changed. Let us not wallow in the valley of despair. I say to you today, my friends, and so even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up, live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day, even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day, down in Alabama, with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification, one day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted, and every hill and mountain shall be made low. The rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places shall be made straight, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. This is our hope. And this is the faith that I go back to the South with. With this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day. This will be the day when all of God's children will be able to sing with new meaning, "My country, 'tis of thee. Sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride. From every mountainside let freedom ring, and if America is to be a great nation, this must become true. So let freedom ring. From the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire, let freedom ring. From the mighty mountains of New York, let freedom ring. From the hiding Alleghanies of Pennsylvania, let freedom ring. From the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado, let freedom ring. From the curvaceous slopes of California. But not only that, let freedom ring from Stone Mountain of Georgia. Let freedom ring from Lookout Mountain of Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi. From every mountainside, let freedom ring. And when this happens, and when we allow freedom ring, and when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholic, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, "Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we're free at last." Thank you. Dr. King was working with President Kennedy toward the passage of some civil rights legislation. But as you know, on the 22nd day of November of that same year, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated. President Lyndon Johnson, working in the memory of President Kennedy, pushed for and got the passage of the Civil Rights Bill the following summer of 1964. Dr. King and other civil rights leaders were invited to the White House to witness the signing of the Civil Rights Bill. But his work wasn't done. There was yet another major hurdle that many blacks still needed to get over, and that was simply being able to register and vote. If you did go down to register to vote, often obstacles were put in your path. You were sometimes asked to pay a poll tax. The poll tax was generally $10. It doesn't sound like very much money today, but you must realize that in the 1960s, the average daily wage of a black laborer was $2 to $3 per day. So you were being asked to pay a week's wage to register to vote. If you weren't asked to pay a poll tax, you were often given a test. And the tests were quite simple. You'd go to the registrar's office, and they would take out a jar of marbles or jelly beans from beneath the counter. And if you could tell them how many marbles or jelly beans were in the jar, that showed that you had the capacity to vote. There were other tests. You were sometimes asked to recite the preamble to the Constitution. Knowing that that was the test, many blacks learned the preamble and would recite it when asked. The ones given the test didn't know it. They had to try to find a copy to follow along. And when you were done, they would say things like, well, you missed a word. Anything to keep you from passing that test. And of course, if you did pass that test and you became a registered voter, there were other things that might happen to you. If you had any outstanding loans, your loans could be called. You know, today we have usury laws. If you borrow money from a lending institution, they must give you a set time to pay that money back, assuming you're making your monthly payments, properly. They must give you a set time to pay that money back. But back then, they could call your loan whenever they got ready. And if you couldn't pay your loan off in full, whatever you pledged as collateral would be taken away from you. How many of you could pay off your visa tomorrow if your loan was called? Or perhaps your student loan, if your loan was called. But that was the dilemma that many blacks faced. If you had a job, you could be fired from your job simply because you became a registered voter. I never will forget when my dad decided to register to vote. We owned a small farm outside of my hometown of Lake Providence, Louisiana. And our farm was mortgaged. Our farm equipment was mortgaged. Our farm vehicles were mortgaged. We even had a loan on the furniture in our house. And my dad wanted to register to vote. I had never seen my mom so afraid in all of my life. I never will forget it because he called us all together to discuss it. By the way, I have 4 brothers and 6 sisters. We were the small family in our community. Yes, we were the small family. And by the way, for that one person, the same mom and same dad. The family next to us, there were 12 kids in that family. And the family next to them, there were 15 kids. We were the small family. But he called us all together to discuss it. And I still can't figure out why he did that, because whatever he decided, that was it. But we had that discussion, so it was decided that he would register to vote the next day. Now, my dad had an off-farm job, as many farmers did then, in fact, as they do today. He had an off-farm job working in town at a store that sold shoes and clothes. And I won't forget it because the next day when he went to work, me and one of my brothers went with him because we wanted to witness this event for our family. Normally when he went to work, he wore khaki pants and sports shirt, but this day he wore one of his finest suits. He went in early, and When he got there, he confronted the owner-manager of the store. His name was Quincy Stapleton. He said, Mr. Stapleton, he said, I want you to know that when it's time for my break this morning, I'm going to walk over to the courthouse and I'm going to register to vote. And he said, I need to know right now whether I should come back. And Mr. Stapleton looked at my father and he said, J.D., that's what they all called him. He said, J.D., you going on. You going on over there. And you take your time. Take your time. And when you're done, well, you come on back. You come on back. Come on back. Well, my father registered to vote that day. He didn't lose his job, and we still own that farm today. But many people lost their cars, their jobs, their homes, their farms. Many lost their lives simply because they wanted to register to vote. Dr. King's biggest push for voter registration took place in Selma, Alabama. Some of you may have seen foul footage of those 600 to 800 people trying to cross the Edmonds-Pettis Bridge there outside of Selma. They simply wanted to march downtown to show their desire to register to vote. They were met at the foot of the bridge by state police on horseback wielding billy clubs, other state police manning high-powered water cannons, other police manning attack dogs, pushing them back across the bridge. Dr. King said, if you want to allow us to march to the courthouse, we will march to the State House. So they marched from Selma to Montgomery, state capital. They started out with that 600 to 800, but by the time they got to Montgomery, there were more than 20,000 in the march. Along the way, one of the marchers was heard to cry out, how long will it take? How long will prejudice blur the vision of men? Dr. King heard that question, but he didn't answer it until he was standing near the steps of the state capitol speaking to the crowd of 20,000. In response to that question, he said, no matter how difficult the hour, no matter how frustrating the moment, it will not be long, because truth crushed to earth will rise again. How long? Not long, because no lie can live forever. How long? Not long, because you shall reap what you sow. How long? Not long, because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. How long? Not long. That became their battle cry, and they marched on until the Voters' Rights Bill was passed in the summer of 1965. Dr. King and others were again invited to the White House to witness the signing of the Voters' Rights Bill. I said earlier in my presentation that Dr. King had been arrested almost 24 times. Many people don't realize that he also received numerous threats on his life. And all of those threats were not idle threats. As you know, his home was bombed. He received as many as 24 threats per day. Now, I know that doesn't compare to the nearly 300 threats per day that our current president received, but Dr. King did not have the protection of the Secret Service. In fact, he didn't even have a bodyguard. He didn't believe in violence. Someone once asked him, how is it that you're able to operate under these circumstances? He answered that question by telling this brief story. He said that he had been out working with one of his steering committees late one night, didn't get home until around midnight. And he said, as soon as he climbed into bed, the telephone rang. And on the other end of the line was a very ugly voice, a voice that said, N-word, we're tired of your mess now. And if you're going out of town within 3 days, we're going to blow up your home and kill your family. We're going to kill you. He said he hung up the phone and got back into bed, but he couldn't sleep. He had heard these types of threats before many times, but for some reason, this one had gotten to him. He couldn't sleep. He thought perhaps if he got up and went to the kitchen and heated up some coffee, this might help him settle his nerves and get some rest. He said he sat there at that kitchen table. He thought about his loving and devoted wife who was asleep in the next room, thought about the fact that she could be taken away from him in an instant. He thought about his little girl. He only had one child at the time, Yolanda. He called her Yoki. He thought about the fact that she too could be taken away from him in an instant. He thought about his father, Daddy King, a very powerful man in Atlanta, but he was in Montgomery, more than 150 miles away. Couldn't call on Daddy, couldn't call on Mama. He said he sat at that table and he realized that it was time for him to call on his other father, the one he preached about every Sunday, the father that could make a way out of no way. He said he sat there at that kitchen table and he began to pray. And after a while, he began to pray out loud. And he said, as he prayed, he heard a voice that said, "Lo, I will be with you even until the end of the world." And he said from that moment forward, he was never afraid of anything or anybody. That is why many believe he went on to Memphis. All of his advisors were saying, "Martin, let's not go to Memphis. We're getting more threats out of Memphis than any other place we've ever decided to go." I opened my presentation with the words from one of his favorite songs, "If I Could Help Somebody." And that is how he lived his life. And that's a part of the message that I leave with you here today, that you too try to help somebody so that your living will not be in vain. He went there to help those black sanitation workers who were on strike for better jobs and better working conditions. Now, I know you may be saying in your own mind right now, what better job or better working condition could a sanitation worker want? Well, those black sanitation workers simply wanted to be able to drive the garbage truck. They weren't allowed to drive the garbage truck. It would mean a 10-cent per hour raise. In fact, they weren't even allowed to sit in the cab of the garbage truck, even in bad weather. In fact, that's how the strike got started. They couldn't sit in the cab of the truck, and in certain neighborhoods, they weren't allowed to take shelter. A storm came up. They climbed up in the back of the truck where you throw the garbage to ride out the storm. And when the storm began to subside, the operator forgot that they were in the thing. He hit the button and the gate came down and crushed them to death. They simply wanted to be able to ride in the truck, drive the truck. What better working condition? After throwing garbage onto the truck all morning long, they simply wanted the right to wash their hands before eating lunch. They weren't allowed to wash their hands before eating lunch. The signs that they wore on the picket line simply read, "I am a man. I am a man." In other words, not an animal. Allow me to wash my hands before I eat. He went there to support those sanitation workers. And he was scheduled to address them at a rally that night, April 3rd, 1968. But as it would happen, a huge storm rolled through Memphis at about that time. Believing that no one would go out in this horrific weather, Dr. King stayed back at the hotel. He was working on his next March on Washington, the Poor People's March. He sent Dr. Abernathy over to address whatever crowd that might have shown up at the Masonic Hall. And as soon as Dr. Abernathy walked into the Masonic Hall and looked around, he saw a crowd that numbered more than 2,000 people. He sent word back to the hotel, "Martin, you better get over here. They are waiting for you." Dr. King arrived there shortly, spoke to that crowd for more than 45 minutes. Oh, I'm not going to do that. He talked about his support for the sanitation workers. He talked about the war in Vietnam. As you know, he was against that war. Thought that that money should be used in America for jobs and for the poor. But many historians believe that he told us something else that night. Many believe that he knew that his time had come, that he would not be with us very much longer. And I would like to pick up just a portion of that part of his speech. And I would like for you to decide whether you believe that he knew that his time had come. In that speech, he said, and I quote, "Just a few years ago, I was in New York City autographing the first book that I had written. And while sitting there autographing books, a black woman came up. The only question I heard from her was, 'Are you Martin Luther King?' And I was looking down writing, and I said, 'Yes.' The next minute, I felt something beating on my chest. Before I knew it, I had been stabbed by that demented woman. I was rushed to Harlem Hospital. It was a dark Saturday afternoon. That blade had gone through, and the x-rays revealed that the tip of the blade was on the edge of my aorta, the main artery. And once that's punctured, you're drowned in your own blood. That's the end of you. It came out in the New York Times the next morning that if I had merely sneezed, I would have died. Well, about 4 days later, they allowed me, after the operation, after my chest had been opened and the blade had been taken out, to move around in a wheelchair in the hospital. And they allowed me to read some of the mail that came in, and from all over the states and the world, kind letters came in. I read a few, but one of them I will never forget. I had received one from the president and the vice president, but I've forgotten what those telegrams said. I had received a visit and a letter from the governor of New York, but I've forgotten what that letter said. But there was another letter. It came from a little girl, a young girl, who was a student at the White Plains High School. And I looked at that letter, and I'll never forget it. It said simply, "Dear Dr. King, I am a 9th grade student at the White Plains High School." She said, "While it should not matter, I would like to mention that I'm a white girl. I read in the paper of your misfortune and of your suffering. And I read that if you had sneezed, you would have died. I'm simply writing you to say that I'm so happy that you didn't sneeze." And I want to say tonight, I too am happy that I didn't sneeze, because if I had sneezed, I wouldn't have been around here in 1960, when students all over the South started sitting in at lunch counters. And I knew then as they were sitting in, they were really standing up for the best in the American dream, taking the whole nation back to those great wells of democracy which were dug deep by the founding fathers in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. If I had sneezed, I wouldn't have been around here in 1961, when we decided to take a ride for freedom and ended segregation in interstate travel. If I had sneezed, I wouldn't have been around here in 1962, when Negroes in Albany, Georgia, decided to straighten their backs up. And whenever men and women straighten their backs up, they are going somewhere, because a man can't ride your back unless it is bent. If I had sneezed, I wouldn't have been around here in 1963, when black people of Birmingham, Alabama, aroused the conscience of this nation and brought into being the Civil Rights Bill. If I had sneezed, I wouldn't have had a chance later that year in August to try to tell America about a dream that I had had. If I had sneezed, I wouldn't have been down in Selma, Alabama to see the great movement there. If I had sneezed, I wouldn't be in Memphis to see a community rally around those brothers who are suffering. I'm so happy that I didn't sneeze. And they were telling me, no, it doesn't matter now. It really doesn't matter what happens now. I left Atlanta this morning. As we got started on the plane, there were 6 of us. The pilot said over the public address system, "We're sorry for the delay, but we have Dr. Martin Luther King on the plane. And to be sure that all of the bags were checked, and to be sure that nothing would be wrong on the plane, we had to check out everything carefully, and we've had the plane protected and guarded all night." And then I got into Memphis. And some began to say the threats, or talk about the threats that were out, or what might happen to me from some of our sick white brothers. Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop. And I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. And so I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. Unquote. And as you know, on the very next day, while standing on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel there in Memphis, James Earl Ray took Dr. King's life. In a sermon to his congregation not more than a month before he was assassinated, he told them that he had been thinking about his own death, that he had been thinking about his own funeral, but he said, I'm not thinking about it in a morbid sense. I'm just thinking, what is it that I would want said? So he went on to tell them, if any of you are around when I have to meet my day, I don't want a long funeral. And if you get somebody to deliver the eulogy, tell them not to talk too long. What is it that I would want said? Tell them not to mention that I have a Nobel Peace Prize. That's not important. Tell them not to mention that I have 300 or 400 other awards. That's not important. Tell them not to mention where I went to school. I just want somebody to be able to say on that day that Martin Luther King Jr. gave his life trying to serve others. I want you to be able to say on that day that Martin Luther King Jr. tried to love somebody. I want you to be able to say on that day that I did try in my lifetime to feed those who were hungry, that I did try in my lifetime to visit those who were sick, that I did try in my lifetime to visit those behind prison bars. Yes, if you want to say that I was a drum major, say that I was a drum major for peace, that I was a drum major for justice, that I was a drum major for righteousness, and all of the other shallow things will not matter. I won't have any money to leave behind. I won't have the fine and luxurious things of life to leave behind. I'll just have a committed life to leave. And that's all I've got to say. If I could help somebody as I pass along, if I could cheer somebody with a word or a song, if I could show somebody that he's traveling wrong, then my living will not be in vain. If I could do my duty as a Christian ought, if I could bring salvation to a world once wrought, if I could spread the message as the Master taught, then my living will not be in vain. Thank you, Dutchess Community College, for inviting me. I'll take any questions now that anyone might have. And for those who must leave, feel free to go ahead and do your thing. Are there any questions? Yes, ma'am, in front.
When did you start doing this and why?
Her question was, when did I start doing programs like this and why? It was I got the inspiration to do these programs in 1983. I went to the 20th anniversary of the March on Washington. It was a reenactment, if you would, of the original march 20 years earlier. And they had dynamic speakers just as they had on that same day. But at around 5 o'clock, when it's about the time that Dr. King gave his speech, they played an audio recording of the dream speech. And it was my opinion and also the opinion of everyone that I was standing near. We were all saying, they've had all of these dynamic speakers all day. Why couldn't they have gotten someone to bring those words to life? And I said, I would never be a part of another program and have to listen to an audio recording of that speech, even if I had to do it myself. So I went home that day, and I began to learn that speech. But as you know, in 1983 was also the beginning of the push to make Dr. King's birthday a holiday. That push lasted 3 years. I, along with many, many other people, I didn't have a great role in this, but every chance I got, when I would speak to groups, I would tell them about contacting their congressperson and pushing for the King holiday. And at the end of my little presentation, I would do an excerpt from one of Dr. King's speeches. So people would tell me, well, you need to do this. You need to develop a program. You need to do Dr. King. And I said, no. You're talking about Dr. King. I can't do King. But I continued to push for the holiday, and at the same time, I began to learn more and more about him, and I spent 3 years at the MLK Library in Washington, D.C., reading and studying everything I could about the man. And in 1986, when his birthday became a holiday, I started doing programs. So the short answer was 1986. Thank you. Is there another question? It's okay. You can. I can see it churning in your mind. Go ahead. Yes, you. Oh. Yeah. Okay. Is there another? You have another? Go ahead. Go ahead.
What do you think of, President Obama, and what do you think of the young black people of today and the direction they're going?
Wow, that's a very heavy question.
Yeah.
Well, I think President Obama is doing the best he can with one hand tied behind his back. He's been saddled with a Congress that won't do anything, even if it's one of their ideas. If he's for it, they are against it. And it's hard to do stuff for the nation, which really confuses me. If I'm a congressman, I want to do what's good for my constituent. But they don't seem to believe that. The opposition won't do anything to help him do good for this country. They believe he'll get too much credit, that his party will get too much credit, and his party would be reelected, which then would keep them out for another 4, maybe 8 years. But people are beginning to see that where the opposition is, and they just may be out for another 4 to 8 years anyway. So why not go ahead and do what's best for the country? That's my personal opinion. As far as blacks are concerned in the nation today, we as a people have come a long, long way. However, I also believe that we still have a long way to go. We've done well in the area of civil rights, but when it comes to economic justice, we're still way behind. We still are up against institutional racism. Institutional racism when it comes to, for instance, interest rates to buy a car, interest rates to finance a mortgage if you can qualify. Even though you work on a job for 20 years, same income as somebody else, you don't qualify for that job or for that mortgage, or you're required to make a larger down payment. Institutional racism. So we still have a long way to go. We've come a long ways, but we're still making progress. And I think a few more years of people doing the right thing, we will, I won't say get to the promised land, but we're going to be awfully close. Yes.
What do you think is making these new generations not to take the torch and act and be more submissive than ever before?
The generation is being what then before?
Submissive, meaning media, it has been taking over. And it is more important to have 300 friends in Facebook than to have 2 friends in your house.
Peer pressure.
And that will be impacting, obviously, in what it is happening, why we don't have another Martin Luther King now, pushing for changes, which we are still long away to get it.
Yeah. Needless to say, I mean, peer pressure has a lot to do with all of our youth today, how they act, how they react to every situation, and wanting to get along. Some, go along to get along. Unfortunately, that seems to be the norm. But it takes a lot of courage and a lot of support from the adults in the room and from parents for kids to do the right thing anymore. And unfortunately, a lot of support isn't there, at least when it's needed. That's not to say that we as parents are not doing a good job of parenting. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying there should be more support throughout the community. The old saying that it takes a village. Well, the village doesn't exist hardly anymore. When you're out there, you're just out there. You don't have the support of the village. So we need that village attitude again in our lives so that we can all prosper.
I think that the role of education having been watered down in such a way where now it's about having a degree and not having the knowledge.
Not having the degree and not having the knowledge.
Having the degree and not the knowledge. I mean, you have a degree but not the support with the knowledge to support that degree.
Yeah, that is a problem, and I don't know what the answer there is. I don't know what the answer to that. What's going to be the solution to that problem? But I think it all lies within all of us to counsel with these students, especially when they get near graduation, on what real life is all about. College life is a wonderful life. There's nothing like it. There's no life like it. But the real life beyond college is not, the two are not the same. And when you get out there, it is very scary and very different. And they just need to be counseled so that when they get there, they'll know and understand that the world is not as pictured on TV. Life is real. It scared me to death when I graduated from college. I said, I got to pay for everything now? And I had a job.
She had a question.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
As a member of the Black History Committee, I want to thank you for bringing the spirit of Dr. Martin Luther King within the walls of this room. And we do have a challenge, and I was just wondering, as you travel in the country, is the apathy the same throughout the country, or are there pockets where the youth and the young people appreciate the work that goes into the types of things that you do and that we try to bring to them?
I can say that, yes, the youth of America is alive and well and kicking and really enthusiastic about life and about things that are going on. I don't find them to be subdued in any way. They've got, sometimes they got some crazy ideas, but this country is built on crazy ideas. So let's just do it. And they go after it, and I support them all the way. They're doing some wonderful things. Most of them. You see, we only hear about the one or two that don't. And those are the ones that sort of mess up everything for everybody else. But the majority of them, it's great. I'm real proud of them. I'm proud of our youth. And I've seen them from coast to coast. Yes. I'm going to be around here for a while. So for all of the shy people who don't want to ask a question in public, I'll be right here to talk to you after the program. So let me thank you for allowing me to be here with you today. Thank you.